I woke up on Sunday and I felt sick to my stomach about what was going on in Ukraine. And I felt this terrible sense of urgency that was made more real when I found out the nuclear power plant had been captured. And I went into a fit of anxiety. And in my own world, when I have feelings, I think, what is the feeling trying to tell me? And I was like, okay, anxiety, what are you trying to tell me? What can I, Stephanie Atkins, in Stillwater, Minnesota, do? And this man immediately came into my mind because I did graduate work underneath him as my advisor. And I remembered that he was from the Ukraine. I remembered that he was a very learned man who knew all kinds of things about the world that we live in and the past. And it just seemed like a natural fit to say, hey. So the initial thought was to have it in my condo. Thank you to Tim and Debbie Swanson, who said, well, we could have it at our house, and then recognized right away, it's probably not gonna fit into our house. And Debbie called Chuck, and Chuck said, yes, we can have it in the boardroom. And then it was in the middle ballroom, and now here we all are. So I would really appreciate if everyone would give a round of applause to the Water Street Inn for opening up their doors. And to Alex, our tech guy extraordinaire from the Water Street Inn, and also for Julie. I told Julie she has made this so easy and fun that I really want one of my kids to get married so that I can have the event here. And I do have 4 adult children. One of them's already married and the other 3 are like, no, Mom. I'm sorry, I'm not getting married just for you, for this alone. So I also want to thank Rose Floral because Debbie went and asked Rose Floral, and these beautiful sunflowers on the center tables are thanks to them. I want to thank Lee Brinisted for this beautiful piece of artwork that I saw on Facebook, and I, messaged her and said, Lee, can we use this? This is what I'm thinking of doing. And she not only said yes, she said, I'll be there. So I'm very grateful to her as well. And I'm really grateful as well to all of you for opening up your hearts in ways that have been really moving to me. These flowers here are thanks to Debbie and Neil Kruger. They just spontaneously brought them, and can you imagine this without these flowers here? Aren't they gorgeous? So thank you for that. And also, thanks to Pastor Johan, we have beautiful bookmarks that we'll hand out later that are with Psalm 27, and there's some meaning to that as well. But we'll get to that in a moment. It doesn't matter who we are, where we fall on the political spectrum, what our religious beliefs are, what we think. What I am so amazed by here tonight, well, first of all, let me say, I started out knowing half of you, now I think I only know like a third of you. But the third of you that I know, I can tell you for a fact, you are all over the political spectrum, and you are all very different. But what is inspiring to me, and what is a gift to me, is that we have all rallied around the Ukrainian people and their courage and their commitment that there is a place we all call home. And we deserve to have that home. We deserve to have agency over our life. We deserve to have the freedom to be whomever we want to be. And that's, I dare say, a gift that they are giving to us at a very big price. And I would like us all actually to applaud for each other in a moment, because here's the thing. We are hurt over and over again. We talk about how polarized we are. We talk about how we're so different. We talk about the fraying of the American fabric. But I'd like to say tonight, as Americans, we care. We care. We care about ourselves, we care about our country, and we care about others. And there is no people more trouble than us. So, I'm getting emotional, which means, I told you about emotions, that's my key. Stop. Like, stop right now. So in a moment, I'm gonna have Dr. G come on up here. I sent you all his bio so you know that he's an amazing individual who studied in physics in Moscow, was one of the first scholars to come to the United States to study theology after the Soviet Union dissolved, and has done many magnificent things since then. His own family, his parents have been refugees. They're now in Romania. He may touch upon that a little bit. What is happening right now is really real for him, and he has got a really interesting background. So I encourage you to listen to his presentation, to ask questions, and then to go to Charlie's afterwards to have another drink and to connect as individuals and as people. So, Johan, you've been so gracious to offer to come up and say a prayer for us. And I know that there are many different people from many different religious affiliations, agnostic and atheist alike, but I think we can all agree in the power of good thoughts and prayer to bring us together and to make a difference. So, thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. There's a verse in the Bible that says, "The Spirit intercedes for us with sighs and groans too deep for words." And for all of us, as Stephanie has shared, there is a sighing and a groaning way too deep for words that's going on as we witness this devastation. And for any of you, the separation between families and the loss of home. And the feeling also of tremendous relief that the countries surrounding Ukraine have made their homes available. So there are no refugee camps. I mean, this is a miracle in itself. So let's just take a moment and start with a moment of silence. Give you a chance just to give thanks for whatever it is in this awful situation that you can, and then we'll ask for God's help for those places that are still needing our intercession and help. There's each of us, Lord, here who have some identity with a culture like that of Ukraine that in the course of human history has been under attack. And we understand intuitively what it means to be in a space here in this country where we are insulated from that kind of devastation. And so in our time of grieving and yearning, as our hearts go out to these people who now are facing death simply because they live in a zone where the Russians want to take over, or even the Russian soldiers who don't even know what they're fighting for are battling, and the people are experiencing a devastation, but there's also at the same time cohesiveness that is coming upon a culture that has been, as Stephanie said, so often divided by other lines. So we prayed, Lord, at this time, in the midst of our grief and pain and yearning, that you will, with the bond of love, help us to see a way through so that there can be healing, hope, and peace restored. We know the level of hostility that's within each of us, that we know how easy it is for any one of us to be a Putin in our own little world. We even pray for him, for a transformation of his heart, to bring about the end of this foolishness, this suffering, this devastation, and this senseless killing that is causing so much grief in so many places. Father in heaven, through Christ, help us to stand firm in the face of this awful, awful time. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pastor. Thank you, Stephanie, for these beautiful words. I thought that she should be just continuing, because I think she said many things much better than I could. Good evening, friends, and really thank you for coming here and really showing this incredible, really extraordinary compassion and care. It is true that the things that I will be talking about cut very, very close to the bone, just given the fact that my own family, as Stephanie mentioned, my parents, and it's still very difficult for me to come to grips with the reality of the fact that they are now refugees in the Baltics. And my aunt is on a little suburb of the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, and because the Russians bombed the bridge that separates the little islet in which she's located, she and one of my cousins have been essentially cut off, and they could probably get to the mainland by boat, but that would also mean losing access to car, and so that really is no longer a possibility. And meanwhile, Russian bombers are flying over their heads. So I'd like to talk about, at this point, simply to give you a picture of what's been happening in the past 2 weeks in Ukraine. And of course, many of us are already quite well informed because so much has already been in the news. But then I also would like to pose a question: what forms of aid are especially urgent? I would define this as aid that sort of was needed yesterday, but if it arrives tomorrow, it would still be wonderful. And then ask the question of how we could help. So, as we know, the Russian army attacked Ukraine on the night of February 24th, 2022. The sad, cruel irony here is that February 23rd is the kind of official day of the celebration of the Russian armed forces. And so I guess to make an eloquent statement, there was an attack in the morning hours of 24. Incidentally, Hitler first bombed Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, also in the morning hours at about 4 o'clock in the morning in 1941. The invasion of my country was unprovoked and unjustified. Putin cited the kinds of reasons that were reminiscent of Hitler's grievances that he used to invade Czechoslovakia. Just as Hitler said in 1939, in his now infamous speech of September 12, 1939, that he needs somehow to defend the German-speaking population of Sudetenland, and on that basis he will invade Czechoslovakia. Putin's argument was similar, and that is somehow Russian population of Ukraine needs defending. Well, I am a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. I've actually spoken Russian most of my life, and I can tell you we certainly do not need defending. In fact, what's happening now, in fact, what's happening now is that the kind of carpet bombing of some of the main cities, such as specifically Kharkiv and Mariupol, and today Mariupol was in the news, and I'll mention it. These are actually Russian. These are predominantly Russian-speaking cities. So the liberation happens at the expense of basically killing off hundreds a day. So the reasons, Putin's reasons, I'm not going to belabor because the world doesn't really believe his lies, and he, I think, is entangling himself in the web of lies that is quite pernicious. And the question is, of course, how he can be stopped. So, my people, Ukrainians are presently fighting the second largest army in the world. Just think about that, right? A country of the size of France, but of course was a very, very different GDP from France, is presently fighting the country that has the largest landmass in the world, objectively, significantly greater than any other country. And yet it's still wants more, all to satisfy the hubris and the life and simply the lustful power of one man and his immediate fleet. Now, Putin expected a fast victory and swift capture of large cities. I should say this, that even our best intelligence concurred with that particular Russian forecast. And yet, lo and behold, we are in the second week of war. And I have to say that presently the capital itself is so well protected, both in the air and on the ground, that if Putin wants the city in which I was born, he would really have to try very hard to get it. But the question for us is a different one, and that is at what price, at what human cost? And it's that question that I want to address. And so Putin profoundly miscalculated essentially that swift blitzkrieg, to use the term that Hitler used for a fast invasion of a particular territory, and has now resorted to large-scale destruction of the cities. And specifically, so this is a week ago, and this is just 15 miles on the outskirts of the capital. And essentially, as you can see, people hiding under the bridge, just because there aren't really enough shelters, bomb shelters, for an enormous population of over 40 million people. And as they're hiding under the bridge, the bomb strikes the bridge, and as you can see, a half of the bridge is, as a result, destroyed. This is not from a movie. I really wish this were from a computer game or a movie. I mean, I wish this were a collage, and this is a reality that's just happening on our eyes. So this is the second largest city of Ukraine, and this is Kharkiv, and what you see on the left is its main square, and then what you see on the right is the School of Economics of the second most important university of Ukraine, so the national university that is in the city. Now, for what ungodly reason could you possibly need to strike the School of Economics? Well, it's because your rockets, or rather the people who are trying to aim them, have absolutely no clue what they're doing. The assumption in this particular case, and again, it's just an assumption, is that this wasn't an arbitrary strike, but rather there is an intelligence gathering building that is within about 100 yards from the school, and so hence the destruction. Of course, I should say that in this particular case, at least, we know that people were evacuated from this area before the bomb struck. But still, as you can see, the devastation is massive. Now, this happened just this night. This happened within about 12 hours from the time that I'm speaking. And what you're looking at is Children's and Maternity Hospital in the southern city of Mariupol. 17 people reportedly wounded. And, one has to ask a question, and President Zelensky has asked a question, precisely, who is Putin afraid of? Mothers who are giving birth? Infants? And that's what's happening here. This is an act of complete and senseless destruction that I presume is aimed at simply striking sort of horror into the hearts of Ukrainians. And I will speak about the fact that actually this particular measure does the exact opposite. At least it has been doing the exact opposite. And so we certainly have massive humanitarian challenges. We have the damage to the infrastructure of the main cities, and that of course entails food, water, and heating shortages, and in some cases simply water supply has been cut off. One of the reasons why people are presently furiously evacuating the elderly from the big cities is because the assumption is in 3 days there simply will not be any water. The usual drinkable water that one would expect in this situation. And so the evacuation right now has taken on just a very, very hectic character. And how do I know this? Well, because today, for about an hour, I was on the phone with my brother arranging the evacuation of 3 women, age 81, 57, and 30. Okay, so 3 generations essentially in, and they were simply the relatives of a very, very, very distant sort of friend of mine in college. And so another issue that Stephanie has already mentioned is that presently the largest nuclear plant in Europe is in the hands of the Russian invaders. And so there is a possibility of a nuclear meltdown. Meanwhile, presently at least, we have lost any information and any lead on Chernobyl. And to some of you, Chernobyl would be a familiar word. Yes, in 1986, Chernobyl, just one of Chernobyl's reactors, as you might recall, had a malfunction. As a result, it lost the ability for cooling itself, and essentially exploded. I remember that moment distinctly, or rather, I remember the next day of the moment when it exploded, because I was playing ping pong outside of my parents' apartment building, and I recall my father and mother returning very, very swiftly from Moscow, where my father had a business, and basically immediately telling me to get back home, and the next day we were evacuated, and then of course all hell broke loose. My father was he was a civil engineer, partially responsible for the sarcophagus that was subsequently built to contain the problem of Chernobyl. So psychologically for my father, it's very difficult to become a kind of helpless refugee at the age of 78. It's just not something he would think could happen. Now, of course, humanly speaking, in the eyes of God, we all have moments of helplessness. But you understand, this is not a moment for me to wax philosophical. It's a very real thing. And I guess the grief of my parents is that they, in their age right now, cannot do as much as they could, let's say, when they were the age of me and my brother. So, and this, by the way, this was happening as my brother was driving a vehicle that will become a medical vehicle, specifically to the border with Poland and Ukraine, to then give it to our partners in Ukraine for future use. And so, the terms of ceasefire, by the way, and that's the third point, are essentially constantly being violated, and that, of course, contributes to sort of terrorizing peaceful population. Now, I have to say, I really am in awe of President Zelensky. I truly am in awe of the Ukrainian president. I have to. He has truly shown extraordinary courage. You remember that, of course, we offered to evacuate both him and the First Lady and their children, and he said, I need weapons, I don't need a ride. And the fact that he stayed in the capital, I think, was an incredibly important tactical act. But I also think he was really acting out of the depth of his heart. And that is absolutely extraordinary. Whatever its very complex past, the fact of the matter is that Ukraine has elected itself a fairly secular Russian-speaking Jew from the east of the country, close to Russia, by a landslide of 75% in the democratic election that simply could not be challenged. Now, how in the world could one claim that with a Jewish president, you could have a bunch of Nazis running the country? And that was, of course, it's the absurdity of the highest degree. And the wonderful thing is, nobody in the world, but really people who are committed to the worst forms of conspiracy theories, could possibly believe this nonsense that comes out of Putin's mouth. And that's really an important thing. Every day Zelensky speaks to Ukrainians, and every day he also speaks to Russians. And when he speaks to Russians, instead of dehumanizing them, which would be a natural thing to do when they're destroying your maternity hospitals, okay? Instead of that, he's trying to still appeal to the conscience that might have been left in their brainwashed minds, and to perhaps attempt to change the course of this absolutely senseless, completely senseless destruction of hundreds, if not close to 1,000 of human lives a day, by perhaps peaceful and diplomatic means. And so it's quite extraordinary that Ukrainians presently still have the control of major cities, with maybe one or two exceptions. It's quite extraordinary that the voluntary ground defense battalions are now numbering 150,000 men and women. I mean, look at the pictures online. It's amazing actually to see, women of this. They're the age of my college students. They're the age of my graduate students. And joining this voluntary ground defense battalions. And so if we're going to deal with war that will be a protracted conflict, and of course nobody wants that, these ground defense units are going to be absolutely crucial. And the reason I highlight them is because I actually believe you really need to equip and defend the defenders. And the regular army, of course, is getting tremendous, enormous help from various governments, and that's important and that's crucial. But then the question arises, where can we apply ourselves? And the fact of the matter is, 150,000 is a lot, because the reality is Putin can only keep on the territory of Ukraine about 100,000, maybe 120,000 tops of his troops. I'm not going to get into the tactical details, just simply that's the reality today, that he's got about 100,000 troops. So, and those 100,000 troops, as Stephanie pointed out, they have absolutely no clue what they're actually doing, why they came, and what is it, for what. I mean, this is not even, you didn't even have, 7 years of, SS brainwashing. You don't even have, if you will, some kind of incredible ideology backing this. Most of them, of course, have come A, because they were sent, and B, because they had a mercenary interest. But even the mercenary interest itself, I think, hopefully soon will be eliminated as Russian rubles become toilet paper. Right. And so you also have 70,000 Ukrainian men and women returning from abroad so that they could assist in the fight against Russia. And the question I ask myself, I turned 50 2 days ago, and the question I ask myself is, why am I not among them? And so then the next week, because I was pretty lousy Soviet training, but I was trained for about 3 years in the army, and so it was kind of came as a package with my undergraduate education and something I did in high school. It wasn't great, okay, but I probably would still know how to assemble and disassemble a Kalashnikov. Okay, I haven't used that knowledge for 30 years, thanks be to God, but it's something, and so the question I ask myself is then, what else can I possibly do? What would be the second best, essentially? And I think it's also heartening that 20,000 Army veterans, and these are people, of course, that are highly trained, that know what they're doing, have now also joined as volunteers from other countries, including 3,000 of our own men and women. And I think that itself deserves also an applause. So what are kind of global level solutions? And of course, nothing on this list will come as a surprise to you. We of course need to be keep pushing for economic and diplomatic sanctions imposed on Russia. And I think, of course, while the list at this point is already pretty long, and the sanctions themselves seem to be they seem to be quite substantial and already quite painful, especially SWIFT seems to be quite painful. What is the proof, what is the test that the sanctions are effective? Well, it's Putin's renunciation of power and crown. That would certainly be a good test that effectively the sanctions are, because if half of Ukraine gets destroyed in a few months, what good does it do that with it also Russia gets destroyed? And I think that is one of the elements that President Zelensky is trying to convey when he switches to Russian in his daily sort of speeches and addresses the Russians by saying, look, this is not just the destruction of Ukraine. I mean, these forces of chaos, in fact, are destroying your country too. And from the military perspective, from the tactical perspective, that's sort of war tactics 100, because if you're going to be trying to invade a country that is, if not comparable in size to yours, then it's quite substantial landmass. And so Russia is about 140 million, Ukraine is over 40 million people. So it's about, it's a factor of 3 or 4. So it's not a factor of 10 or 100, right? And so when you're doing this, you're going to destabilize your own country. So obviously US and NATO allies have been providing substantial military aid. We ourselves, the United States, has of course increased that aid, but also today we really had rather disappointing news that on some kind of bureaucratic technicality, they cannot fly the MiGs that are absolutely needed and could be saving lives, that makes air fighters, airplanes, that they cannot fly them from the base, from the Germany's base into Ukraine. Now, one can understand the reason, and the reason would be that this could somehow spook Putin. But the fact of the matter is, he has already violated every conceivable international law, and he's actually announced to the Russians that the sanctions themselves constitute an act of war. Okay, so now he's actually morally equated our sanctions to an act of war. So if that's the case, in his demented mind, his country is already at war with the rest of the world. And of course, that can only lead to Russia's self-destruction, ultimately. But again, at what cost to civilians? At what cost to everybody who is now involved in this struggle? And of course, also, both the European Union and also large private nonprofits are providing very substantial humanitarian aid to refugees. My parents have actually experienced this firsthand, because as they were passing from Ukraine to Moldova, they were actually assisted by a police car to a Romanian border, and then at the Romanian border, they had obviously to wait because there was already a caravan of cars waiting to pass through. But then the next day, they were provided with a lovely college in the village, and they were as they were waiting for my brother. So, they had a roof over their head, because in that area, hotels were a bit of a challenge. It's rural Romania, essentially. And they also had some warm food. And just psychologically, that was just a wonderful and beautiful thing. And after the trauma of moving through the country as it was being shelled, I think this certainly was important. So I think the large nonprofits that are doing fantastic humanitarian help are certainly something that is wonderful. Now, I want to also kind of focus on the things that I wanted to convey to you, and that is what is the most urgent need, and what is specifically the most urgent need on the ground. And I get the updates about this need more or less on a, every 10 minutes that there's something in my messenger from 5 different messages that I have on this. So specifically, what I'd like to focus on is the issue of these voluntary defense units. Now, who are these people exactly? They are civilians that now have been turned into people who will be defending their country. They are teachers, they're engineers, they're businessmen and women, they are artists. I actually have an iconographer friend who is now in this battalion, meaning he's a painter of religious art, and who is bringing the wounded from the battle lines into the major hospital in Kyiv. And I volunteered when the war started in 2014. In 2015, I volunteered at that hospital, and so I know how well the system of volunteers was working, because simply the numbers of wounded at that time, and certainly today, was piling up, beyond any kind of ordinary capacity of the hospital. The second issue, and so what do these defenders, again, we're talking 150,000. Nobody expected that their number would swell to 150,000 men and women. And with also, 66,000 coming from afar. So what do they need? They basically need food supplies that would be enduring. They need medical supplies, the kind of basics, and they need protective gear. So this is as of yesterday, and so what you see is essentially these packed boxes and this is a Ukrainian version of meat jerkies. So this is dried meat. Okay, this is sort of contractors' favorite food. But guess what? If you're in the woods and if you're stuck there with a rifle for a couple of days, this is the kind of thing that you need. So they're essentially bringing it not just to their battalion, but also to a number of other areas. So this is something that, again, was supplied by the people that I'm working with in a NATO country in the Baltics. This was something that was supplied yesterday. Another thing that we bought on a much larger scale, several tens of thousands of dollars of this, because they're so vital, is the tourniquets, essentially. I don't know if anybody knows what those are, but what they are, they're basically fast blood-stopping devices. And guess what? They actually got the American grade ones, the ones that are actually approved by the ESR. Thank God they're still available. Specifically, this was bought in Poland. Okay, and so and they just actually bought another something like $10,000 worth of specifically these devices, because these are the devices that have the greatest efficiency, shall we say, per dollar in terms of the possibility of ultimately saving lives. And instead of advertisements on the Ukrainian TV, now what you have is the best way to hide from a bomb when you are in an apartment building. That's one advertisement, and then the second advertisement is how to use these. Okay, I kid you not. And there are there's a great one. There's a third one, and that is how for the Russians to become a prisoner of war without getting killed. I mean, literally. I mean, they're actually, this is what you need to do so that we actually do not kill you, but take you prisoner. As you can see, I mean, I love Stillwater. For me is a kind of a place of wonderful, beautiful normalcy, tranquility. I like Square Lake. My wife and I come to Square Lake actually kind of very regularly when we can travel further. Of course, there used to be also loom publishers, and for a theologian, that's a big deal. But at this point, and the harbor that has, at this point, life, of course, back home is so normal that all I can think of is this. So what you're looking at, of course, is if I'm not mistaken, is a Land Cruiser, okay, and turned into a medical vehicle. And that's something that we're bringing, again, as we speak this night, across the border between Poland and Ukraine. And the basic notion is there is a dearth of these. I mentioned my iconographer friend, a friend of his who is also driving a vehicle, a driver in this medical car, got shot by a Russian sniper. I mean, why would you want to shoot at a medical vehicle? I mean, which was carrying, it was actually, in that particular case, it was both evacuating people and also carrying wounded. Obviously, you have to kind of multitask in this situation. So what I'm showing also the situation out of which people are being evacuated abroad. And then the second one is, and actually he told me, yeah, it's a used, and of course we're buying them used because nobody knows for how long they will last, so we're buying them at, my brother will probably buy all, Land Cruisers in the proud country of Lithuania by the time he's done. But we're buying them at well under $10,000, and the idea is to get as much as possible out of them before God knows what will happen next time. So this is how a little storage facility looks like, and this is protective gear for the voluntary defense units. And I think, there is a kind of a dictum, and this would be more or less my last point, that any war is a war on children, and the second greatest need is precisely how can we alleviate the suffering of children. And so what we're planning to do, and what we're already doing, is the work with the orphans. Now, this is also an area in which the people that I'm connected with are very, 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 very experienced, and they've been doing, for example, summer camps for orphans, providing them with special skills, and specifically providing sports equipment for them. So the question is, how can we sort of normalize the lives of children post-war? Because I'm thinking about the effort today, but I'm also thinking about the effort that could be undertaken post-war. And at least my own focus is going to be on children. We are sort of calling them children of the war, and that would be defined as a child who lost at least one parent. And so returning them to normalcy. And so what you see here is actually an orphanage where kids make their own desks and kind of derive great satisfaction out of the fact that they can do it. So those types of projects I envision doing in the future. And happily, there is already a private school, kind of a fairly fancy private school in Texas that specializes in STEM, to which we will be able to bring at least 5 ninth graders kind of for a full ride every year, and we'll probably build that to about 40. And because I'm connected to a school in Kyiv, that kind of gave me back, my basis, foundation, my education, etc. At least in my teenage years, understand why it would be important to give these kids this hope today. And I actually don't know if my school would still be standing, by the time Russians are done with the capital. Nobody can guarantee that. I've shown you a bombed hospital and also a bombed School of Economics, so it's very hard to say. So who are our main partners? Specifically, Semantic Force Foundation in Lithuania, that's doing a lot of things, and it's kind of a leg of my brother's company. And then subsequently, a central hospital, Pirogovsk Hospital in Ukraine, and again I mentioned an artist friend, an iconographer friend that's working there. And actually, his icons, his art supports, he told me, about a half of the hospital. So what he does in terms of exhibits, etc., supports the work of the hospital. And then also Allen Academy in Texas, where we will in the future be bringing children of war. Again, the idea would be that these would be kids in difficult circumstances, but also bright kids with some relatively good English that we think would benefit from the kind of education that could be given in the United States. So I think I've given you a lot to ponder, and I think at this point I simply would like to thank you for your attention, and would welcome your questions. Thank you so much.